I'm talking about a period in history, the era of desegregation, which runs from the 1950s through the present. In the first part of my remarks, I want to remind you, many of us know about this already, but I want to remind you of what that entailed, why it happened. Secondly, in a very different phase of our history, I want to talk about the reaction to it and against it that emerged in the 1970s and has been with us ever since. You could argue that the period through which the period I'm discussing has been a kind of struggle, starting in the 1970s between two very different tendencies. I'll be talking as I go along about Presbyterians' role in that, but the main thing I want to do when it comes to Presbyterians is to, at the end of my remarks, talk about the specifically Presbyterian developments that took place as a result of this set of events. So 3 parts. Number 1, desegregation, what it was, how it happened. Second, a reaction against it, a new political and religious mood that developed in the 1970s and after. And then thirdly, specifically Presbyterian developments. The term desegregation is appropriate for discussing this period for one reason, and one reason in my judgment alone. And that is that it involved the delegitimation of segregation as a set of practices and policies. Let me repeat that, the delegitimation of segregation as a set of practices and policies. Before that time, as I discussed last time, segregation was very much, in much of the country, the law of the land. It was what people did. It was taken for granted. Its legitimacy was taken for granted. That was called into question in the period that I'm discussing. And ever since, it has been assumed, even by people who were rather critical of the civil rights movement, it has been assumed that we've turned a page in this country with regard to segregation, and that it is no longer officially legitimate. And the denial of legitimacy to those policies, segregation policies, has led to an ongoing effort, I would say an ongoing struggle to dismantle segregation as a phenomenon. And part of the struggle that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation has to do with people's very different attitudes toward the dismantling of segregation. As I said last time, it began before the 1960s, well before the 1960s. It was actually something which was set in motion, at least in the standard historical accounts of it, by post-World War II developments, especially a couple of crucial ones that I mentioned last time. One was Harry Truman's desegregation of the military by executive order, hugely significant. We've felt the ripple effects of that ever since. And then second, the famous, and in some quarters, infamous decision of the Supreme Court, Brown versus Topeka in 1954, which officially denied legitimacy to to segregation in public schools, hugely significant. Now, most everybody in this group knows that that decision, especially those 2 decisions, and especially the latter one, the desegregation of schools, which was meant to set in motion an ongoing process of desegregating all the segregation that existed in public schools, that met with fierce opposition in the South. It later met with fierce opposition in other parts of the country. Think of Boston, for example. Boston, which back in the days of slavery was a kind of center of abolitionism. Well, in the struggle over desegregation, it was a very, very tough fight to desegregate schools. So what immediately happened once the Brown decision was handed down, immediately within a few years, I mean, they developed what was called in the South and in many other places, massive resistance to that effort. And as I also mentioned last time, equally important, I think, is a reluctance on the part of the Eisenhower administration through the 1950s to use the resources of the federal government, the muscle of the federal government, if you will, to support desegregation policies. Ike personally was very reluctant to send troops, as he eventually did, to Little Rock, Arkansas. but there was a lot of reluctance in that administration. And one of the most important things that happens with the election of Kennedy, and Kennedy is no unambiguous figure on this, but Kennedy, especially Robert Kennedy, but the Kennedy brothers represent a new phase in the development of federal relations with the states and the forces that are resisting this. Now, one of the most important things I have to say this morning is the following. I think that massive resistance would have succeeded had it not been for the civil rights movement. Let me say that again. I think that massive resistance would have succeeded, maybe even to some extent it has succeeded, but it would have succeeded even more dramatically, and the whole effort toward movement in the direction of desegregation might well have petered out had it not been for something which at the time, and looking back historically, I think it's appropriate to still say it was a kind of extraordinary, unexpected development. Extraordinary, unexpected development. And that was the emergence in the 1950s, not the 1960s, but in the 1950s of active and in its own way, equally strong, almost militant resistance to the resistance, the massive resistance on the part of, lo and behold, Black churches. Black church leaders stood up and said, "No, we don't want this. We believe in that Brown decision. We want to see this desegregation unfold." And I say that this was unexpected because primarily if people didn't know much about the Black church. I've been stressing all along, the Black church had within it strong opposition to slavery, to segregation, but that was kind of a corner of the world that so many of whites didn't know anything about. That active opposition to segregation erupted in the 1950s, and it erupted in a very interesting form, a movement of active, nonviolent opposition to segregation, a movement of active, nonviolent opposition, and a movement which was very strategically well thought out. And the person who more than any other symbolizes that strategic move was Martin Luther King Jr., who at the time of his designation as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott was a very young clergyman. He was really just out of graduate school. He'd gotten a PhD at Boston University in theology, interestingly enough. But he was in the pastorate there in Montgomery just a couple of years when this broke out, and he became the leader of that movement and had, by that point in his life, begun to develop a rather definite philosophy regarding social change. And that philosophy in a nutshell was that this: when there was injustice, Christians had a responsibility to stand up and resist it in a specifically Christian way. Let me say that again. Stand up, resist it. As they said in the time, put your body on the line if necessary to resist it, but in a specifically Christian way. And of course, that was the philosophy of nonviolence. And so what emerges out of the Montgomery bus boycott is sit-ins, boycotts, marches. All of us who had some exposure to it in those years will remember it well. It was a kind of dramatic eruption, and it was mainly came from two sources: Black churches, which up to that point had been looked upon, including by many people who were sympathetic to the cause of desegregation in the North, as a passive force, because it had accepted so much of segregation. But out of the Black church, and it really was the Black church, there emerges this sort of muscle of resistance, combined with another source, which is students, especially an organization called SNCC at the time, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by a young man who was eloquent in his own way, named John Lewis. At the time, Lewis was outshone enormously by Martin Luther King, but Lewis, of course, ultimately was to become a very important public figure himself. And they worked together. SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, worked hand in glove to develop a campaign throughout the South of resistance to the Southern white citizens councils and all those bodies that were developing to resist the demand for desegregation. Now, this was a movement. In this place, I don't need to make the point I'm about to make in great length. I'll tell you, if I were at a university today, even at Georgetown, I would probably have to make this next point rather elaborately. And the point simply is this: this was a movement which had distinctly religious overtones. This was a movement which had distinctly religious overtones and drew so much of its strength from what King himself characterized as the spirituality of the Black church. The spirituality of the Black church was the resource that led these people to do what I think can only be characterized as heroic things. We all have the image in our mind of Selma. Selma's just a symbol, however. This happened in place after place after place in confronting what was known to be a violent force with this aggressive nonviolence. Let me just describe the religious ethos of the movement for a moment. It's a very interesting combination, and I think it has lessons to teach us today about public life. It was a very interesting combination of Christian theology and what I would characterize as American civil religion. Let me say that again: Christian theology and American civil religion. King himself, in his public statements, and if you look carefully at John Lewis even more, they were very cautious in introducing specifically Christian themes. They would do it occasionally, but for the most part, they appealed to the ideals of America, the ideals of America. Now, the other thing I want to stress about this movement, which is directly related to our story of this whole series, is the following. King, boy, was he a strategic thinker. That's one of the things I admire about him so much. He said in his writings the following. He said, "It has always puzzled me why the white church has been so complicit in racism. It just puzzles me." He says, I've been to seminary, I've read the books written by these theologians. He said, it just seems to me it's a no-brainer that the white church should be outspoken in its criticism of racism. Yet it's not. And of course, he knew firsthand, if you read the letter for the Birmingham jail, you know it's a response to white clergy who were telling him, stop, desist, this is getting too close to danger. So King uses the whole strategy of the civil rights movement. Really was designed to do the following. It was designed to appeal to the wider nation, to be sure. And television, mass media played a very important role in this. There was street theater, which was designed to appeal through television to the wider public. But above all, it was designed to appeal to white churches, especially to the leaders of white churches. And King sometimes could be pretty blunt in his address to white other clergy, white clergy. Look, people, this is what you preach. Now, here's what we need to do by way of challenge. Now, I'm going to borrow a term here from CBS in its characterization of the Final Four in basketball. You know, they have that little thing at the very end of when the winner is crowned, is named. They then play one shining moment. Well, those of you who are basketball fans will remember that sort of anthem, which is now part of the sort of NCAA treatment of the Final Four every year. I want to suggest that this particular moment in the history of American Presbyterianism, and above all white Presbyterianism, is a shining moment. There haven't been many shining moments in this story I've been telling you. Here comes a shining moment. To the astonishment of observers, when this sort of thing became evident, beginning in the early 1960s, leading up to the March on Washington, the leadership of the white churches, at least in the National Council of Churches, responded to King's challenge by saying, yes, he's right. We've got to do something about this. We've got to line up behind this movement of nonviolent resistance to segregation in the South. You may recall in my last presentation, I talked about the ecumenical movement as kind of an incubus developing. And one of the main reasons for that, I'm convinced, was that was the first place really where the white church leadership had to confront the Black leadership actually face to face in one meeting after another. I think that changed the mood. And I'm stressing all along here the kind of ignoring of the Black voice until a certain point. And here's the point at which the Black voice finally is recognized. And indeed, the Black voice sets the tune, or sets the terms on which the the thing moves forward. Now, I take pride in the fact that the Presbyterians, the mainline Presbyterians, both North and South, I want to stress, both North and South, although in the South it was a much more muted response for obvious reasons. There was a deep division in the Southern Church on this, but officially, both the Northern and the Southern Church responded by saying, we've got to take action. We've got to be resolute in our attack on this resistance to desegregation. And so they created something called the Commission on Religion and Race. That was a sort of extension of the National Council of Churches, which also had a Commission on Religion and Race. They put money behind it. They put staffing behind it. As we all know, a lot of session members in this group, churches really make their statements with where they put their budgets. Well, they put money behind this. They put very strong staff, and they developed, the Northern Presbyterians developed a national leader who later became the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, partly because of this. You've probably heard of Eugene Carson Blake, a figure who up to that point had been thought of as a kind of, well, I'm tempted to say faceless, sort of colorless church bureaucrat, but stepped out himself and played a leadership role in what? Mobilizing the church, in this case, the PCUSA and the Southern Church to some extent, for active participation in the civil rights struggle. Let me give you two illustrations of how that worked. In the early 1960s, there was something called the Mississippi Summer, which was sponsored by SCLC and SNCC together. SCLC, thinking about this just kind of amazes me. In the Deep South at that point, it was very difficult for a Black person to register to vote. When you hear these people saying today, people suffered and died in order that I could vote today, that's what they're talking about. In the Deep South, there was enormous resistance, and it was violent resistance to, if necessary, violent resistance to registering Blacks to vote. The SCLC and SNCC decided to mobilize people from all over the country to fight that. And the PCUSA in particular sent out a call to clergy and lay people too, but mainly clergy, to go to the South and participate in what they called Freedom Summer, which was essentially going door to door, mobilizing Blacks, persuading Blacks, and then taking them to the place where they could register and monitoring that registration. In that couple of summers, the PCUSA mobilized over 400 clergy from all over the country. And you can imagine the conversations that went on in session meetings when the pastor said, I'm going south for a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Churches split over this. Clergy lost their jobs over this. But over 400 people, and a couple, by the way, lost their lives in Mississippi. That was a dramatic moment in the life of the church, in the whole church, because even where there was resistance to it, there was conversation about it. Whether you were in New York or California or Oregon or whatever, you were responding to this challenge. And the other thing was, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, of course, Lyndon Johnson comes to power and immediately submits the Civil Rights Bill, which becomes the great piece, the landmark piece of legislation in turning the corner on desegregation. If there's anything which symbolizes beyond the things I've already talked about, the delegitimation of segregation, it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, when that was when the legislative process was leading to the enactment of that piece of legislation, there was enormous resistance in the Senate, enormous resistance, filibusters and all this stuff. Again, Blake and his people, and the sort of the corresponding Black figure is somebody who lived in this area for a while before his death. Gay Wilmore, you may have heard of him. He was the staff guy for the Commission on Religion and Race, very close ally of Martin Luther King. They sent out an appeal to congregations throughout this country to mobilize letter writing campaigns to put pressure on members of Congress from all over the United States to get this piece of legislation passed. Hubert Humphrey, who was the person who was responsible for shepherding the legislation through to its ultimately successful adoption, was quoted as saying at one point, if it hadn't been for the churches, this would not have happened. Let me say that again. If it hadn't been for the churches, this would not have happened. And as somebody who was a theological student at that point, I was, I will testify, it seemed to me that that was very much the case, that there was a kind of mobilization. And of course, it wasn't just Presbyterians, it was mainline Protestants generally through the National Council of Churches. The upshot of that, and by the way, the other thing to note about the public opinion data shows that in that period, the mood of the country with respect to segregation and desegregation shifted rather dramatically in favor of civil rights legislation. A big period of about 3 or 4 years when there was a kind of golden moment in which the mood of the country was, we've got to do this. This is the right thing to do. And of course, there was a passage of a whole series of policies and pieces of legislation, which to some extent set the table, set the stage for things we've been living through ever since. Affirmative action, war on poverty, busing, of course, the issue of school busing, which ultimately becomes such a cause célèbre all over the country. And of course, the war on poverty. The war on poverty is a direct result of this too. A whole series of things that unfold in the 1960s. That's the first part of the story. And it's, as I say, if you believe that the churches have a responsibility to directly confront racism with regard to Black-white relations, this above all, other than maybe a few moments at the time of the struggle over slavery, is the shining moment for Presbyterians and more broadly mainline Protestants. And they took the lead, and it was very clear that they were pushing the country to do something which, because they had a kind of moral claim on the country, could be said to be the right thing to do. However, I go now to my next part of this set of remarks. As you all know, we lived through this. The mood changed rather dramatically, and frankly, rather quickly. By as early as the late 1960s, already the mood was shifting. The best symbol of that is the election of Richard Nixon to the presidency, and Richard Nixon was pretty open about his what eventually came to be known as the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was a signal to people who wanted to resist segregation, who wanted to resist desegregation, excuse me. I'm going to be the kind of president which will soften the role of the federal government in pursuing desegregation. I'm opposed to busing. I'm opposed to affirmative action. I'm opposed to, and where he didn't state explicitly that he was opposed to, he sort of implied it. And that, of course, is a turning point in American political electoral history as well as other things. The reason as to why what was the reason for the shift in mood? If this were, again, a class of many weeks, I could go into this in much greater detail. I will just list a few of the things. People say it's complicated, and it is complicated. For example, in the late 1960s, the civil rights movement was intertwined with something which had a very, very different relationship to the American public, and that is resistance to the Vietnam War. The two things were morphed together, and King, near the end of his life, is becoming a rather strong anti-war figure, and his sort of public identity is already becoming more complicated in the mind of many whites. It's also the period in which, terribly, toward the end of the late 1960s, there is a season of riots, of bloody riots with the destruction of property and so forth in one major American city after another. It's also the period in which there's the emergence in the Black community of something very different from King's philosophy of nonviolence, and that is the whole idea of Black power, which has been a part of the sort of complicated struggle of ideas ever since. All of that, I'm going to concede, and yet I want to say the following. In my own view, and this is just my own rendition of it, I think ultimately the reason why the mood changed so profoundly, especially in church circles, was a kind of racism. And I say that for the following reason. The 1970s were a time in which the religious situation in the United States changed profoundly. We've been living with the consequences of that ever since. There's a famous book on this by Robert Withnow called The Restructuring of American Religion. And the restructuring of American religion which we've been living through, began in the 1970s. And the thing which above all drove that restructuring of American religion was the following: the creation of a new kind of conservative white Protestantism, the creation of a new kind of conservative white Protestantism, which by the 50s and 60s had largely been marginalized. It had been driven to the margins of American life by the success of mainline white Protestantism, which was going from strength to strength. Those churches were in the suburbs, becoming larger and larger and larger, more influential. That's one of the reasons why they were so successful in forwarding the cause of desegregation in the 1960s. But in the 1970s, a different kind of religious environment emerges. And I'm going to say it's got more than a tinge of racism about it. I'll get to why I say that in just a moment. But I'm talking about the kind of conservatism which we now associate with tele-evangelism. This is the period in which tele-evangelism, a phenomenon that most of us have lived with our whole lives, really gets a toehold in American, not just American religious life, but American public life generally. Secondly, the emergence of the independent, freestanding, conservative white church, the independent, freestanding white church. Think McLean Bible Church, big, and that's the third thing. The emergence of these mega churches, typically freestanding around, but a set of ideas which are very closely linked to a political as well as religious conservatism. Now the initial, and then you have names, important figures that begin to replace the Eugene Carson Blakes of this world, the Bishop Pike, his parallel in the Episcopal Church. Those figures begin to recede, and you get the likes of Jerry Falwell and others that emerge on the scene as public figures as well as religious figures. Now the interesting thing is, when you look particularly at Falwell's a fascinating case. By the way, if there's ever an argument for a well-educated clergy, it's Jerry Falwell, and it's a negative argument. He was not well-educated at all. He went to, I'm going to sound very elitist here, I guess I am, he went to a rather inconsequential Bible college, and that was it, no seminary training. And yet he emerges as this major religious figure in the public mind in the 70s and 80s. Falwell initially, and it's so interesting to read his writing on this, his speeches on this, he was initially very, very critical of the civil rights movement, very critical of Martin Luther King in particular. And why was he critical? Not a word about race, not a word about race. Instead, it was mixing of religion and politics. Mixing of, the gospel is about the saving of souls, not public affairs. Well, needless to say, his tune changed pretty quickly. By the late 1970s, and this was cultivated by certain political forces, he and others turned rather sharply in the political direction with the creation of organizations like the Moral Majority, the Religious Right, an organization actually, Ralph Reed's organization, Focus on the Family, that whole network of religious organizations which were grounded in what I would characterize as white evangelical Protestantism, which were overtly linked to political forces, and in particular the Republican Party. And it's just stating the obvious. Any of my colleagues, former colleagues at Georgetown who study elections would tell you this. They played a consequential role, a very consequential role in the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. Very consequential role. Reagan actively cultivated them. And he presented himself as a kind of model of a certain way of thinking about Christianity and American life. A lot of the restorationist themes in Reagan have to do with restoring something which was linked to American civil religion. But let me say also, Reagan, just like Nixon, sent those signals that I do not have any desire or intent of actively enforcing the desegregation laws. I'm not going to do that. I'm opposed to affirmative action. I'm opposed to busing. I'm opposed to the standard measures which had been developing in the late 1960s and afterwards as kind of a coherent strategy for pursuing desegregation. Now, I want to stress that even though the organizations that I've mentioned had nothing overtly racist about them, they weren't actively opposed to desegregation if you read their pronouncements. They were almost entirely exclusive, I was tempted to say exclusively, that's too strong. They were almost entirely made up, their membership, of whites. These were white churches, white religious movements. And by the way, when they would try to make contact with Black churches and what the Black churches represented, on the whole, those conversations did not go well, because the Black churches wanted something which they were not about to provide. Indeed, the Black churches came to see them as forces working actively against their interests. But beyond that, I want to stress the following, and it seems to me this is what needs to be taken into account when you think about the emergence of, let's call it broadly, the religious right in relation to our topic. And I bring this up because it seems to me it is central to the topic that I'm discussing in this series. Most important, but not the only thing, is the following. The religious right actively aided and abetted the resistance, especially in the South, but not just in the South, to the desegregation of public schools. Let me say that again. They actively aided and abetted the resistance to desegregation of public schools. Keep in mind, for many people, that was the most obvious practical issue at stake ever since the idea of desegregating the public schools began to become a topic. How did they do this? How did they aid and abet the cause of resistance to desegregation? Well, the answer is very simple. They created a whole network of Christian schools, which were almost exclusively white academies. Indeed, some of them were openly white. That is, they had criteria in their admissions policies, and of course their staff as well, which limited the student population and the staff to people who are white, and oftentimes white, who were kids who were members of these families who were active in the churches. So they contributed, and they were, this is not a small contribution. In many communities, this was the key thing that enabled people to resist sending their kids to a school where there were Black kids. I want to say this, above all, was true of white evangelical Protestant schools, much less true of Catholic schools. Many people said, well, we've already got here and out, we can go to the Catholic schools, but the Catholic schools were much less sympathetic to the cause of segregation. By this point, going back to our issue that Rob raised earlier, they had, you might say, got religion and were very reluctant to embrace in any direct way segregation. So it was mainly white academies run by evangelical churches. And by the way, when I drive around Northern Virginia and go from church to church to church, from place to place, and see these academies, oftentimes the church will, right next door to the church will be such and such Christian school. I often wonder, is this the kind of thing, is this one of those schools? Virginia, of course, was one of the centers of this kind of resistance. Second, the lawyers in the room will appreciate what I'm about to emphasize. Once it became evident that the IRS was going to resist just winking at this and granting these schools the tax-exempt status, there was a quick jump to the use of religion as a defense of racial discrimination. Let me say that again. The use of religion as a justification for discrimination on the grounds of race. The celebrated case, of course, was Bob Jones University, which was overtly racist, overtly exclusionary. But it went through the courts. And by the way, I'm sure all of you are just immediately thinking, we're not done with this, because this set a pattern for an ongoing sort of history of litigation in which conservative Protestants have used the idea of religious liberty as a justification for practices which are discriminatory. The other thing, of course, which has to be noted is that, and this is long before Trump, I want to stress this is long before Trump, by the late 1970s, these white evangelical churches were rather unambiguously and overtly identified with the political forces which were clearly identified with resisting desegregation. I've already mentioned the names of Nixon and Reagan. There were others, of course, who fell into this, and they identified themselves rather directly. And the more time went by and they had these Christian schools and the litigation strategy I've just named, the more inclined they were to just solidly link in with the political forces that were actively opposed to desegregation. The last thing I want to say on this is the following. They did this without apology until recently. And I just want to briefly note the apology, which is so interesting. In a way, what I'm about to say is a kind of interesting twist on sort of how history has strange twists and turns. In the recent history of these evangelical churches, which have been so strongly on the side of resisting desegregation, in the last 4 or 5 years, primarily because of generational change, they have started to, in various ways, openly repent of their past, including, I'll get to this in just a second, the one that's most familiar to us, the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America. You know, the splinter church, that the most important one that broke off in the direction that I've been describing here, broke off from mainline Presbyterianism. The new leadership, and these are younger people, the new leadership of the PCA, some of whom are Black, interestingly enough, now, but not all, openly say the following. And even at a General Assembly that apparently was a very tumultuous affair, they passed a statement of repentance for the history of the PCA's involvement in resistance to desegregation. It's really remarkable. The Southern Baptist Church has done the same thing. Southern Baptist Church says, we deeply are sorrowful for the role that our church has played in aiding and abetting the resistance to desegregation. So it seems to me now it's pretty clear that we're in a position to say, by the church's own self-understanding of their history, they were deeply implicated in the struggle to what? Maintain some form of segregation. Now, let me talk finally in the next 10 minutes about specifically Presbyterian developments. I've been speaking generally here about a story which I think could, a variation of the story could be told in a Methodist setting, an Episcopal setting, a Baptist setting. Not so much the Lutherans, that's a different situation, but the Presbyterian, specifically Presbyterian developments that are worth noting are the following. The first thing I think it's important to note is this. At the time the Civil Rights Movement occurred, the Northern Church was called UPUSA, United Presbyterian Church in the USA. It eventually became morphed into the PCA through a process that I'll talk about in just a second. But that church, whether it's UPUSA or eventually PCA, that took on a very different character as a result of the Civil Rights Movement from the character it had previously had. Let me say that again. It took on a very different character, especially with regard to the issue of race, than it previously had. It took on a character in which it was just taken for granted, at least in judicatories, in synods, presbyteries, General Assembly, that the church was unambiguously on the side of desegregation. Let me say that again, unambiguously on the side of desegregation, and that it was actively pursuing that goal, which had been articulated in the late 1940s. We pursue the idea of a desegregated church and a desegregated society. Committed, therefore, actively as a church, internally and externally, to promoting desegregation And that's why we've been hearing ever since within the denomination talk about anti-racism, diversity, diversity, anti-racism. It's a mantra, and it's because of the, I would say the situation of the church was much more ambiguous. The identity of the church was much more ambiguous. We have become rather explicitly on the side of desegregation as a cause, as a commitment. But at the same time, and this is part of the same point I'm trying to make here, the church has steadily declined in size and public influence. In 1965, it was at the zenith of its numerical strength. The two denominations together, the Southern Church and the Northern Church, had over 4 million members, 4.5 million. That was the largest membership it had ever had. And of course, now it's down to 1.3. And that began to take place right about the time that there was this shift in the direction of a new religious mood that I've been describing since the 1970s. The decline took place, and the public influence of Presbyterians and more broadly, mainline Protestants steadily declined. I thought it was interesting yesterday in the Post, a very interesting article about what kind of, in their version of a religion section, there was a brief article on what kind of people are in the religious community is Biden likely to be talking to. Hardly any mainline Protestants, hardly any. It's interesting. And of course, that's just facing the political realities. Mainline Protestantism is no longer a significant public presence. That began to happen. And as a result of that, I would suggest mainline Protestants and Presbyterians in particular, Presbyterians being, you might say, on the cutting edge of that mainline Protestant initiative back in the 50s and 60s, have tended, even though they talk about public issues, to basically turn inward in their preoccupations. Much less able, let alone confident, to step forward and say, we as a church are going to try to provide leadership in the wider public, in the wider society. Rarely, maybe locally, but certainly not nationally. So that's the first point. Related to that, the second thing that's worth noting is the following. Directly as a result, I can't think of any other way to put this, directly as a result of the turbulence of the 1960s, there were two schisms that splintered mainline Presbyterians. One was the emergence of a new denomination called the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA, created in 1973, and then another one created in the 1980s, which was much more a northern phenomenon called EPC, Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Now, as a result of the emergence of those two denominations, the mainline Protestant denominations, initially two and then eventually later one, the mainline Protestant Presbyterian denominations lost hundreds of member congregations, hundreds of them. The interesting thing is the PCA and the Evangelical Presbyterian Church were heralded by their proponents, by the people who took the leadership in this, as something that was bound to displace mainline Presbyterianism. They said, churches are going to flock to our ranks, and we are going to grow, and they are going to decline. And we are declining, to be sure, but they have not grown anywhere near what was predicted. They're still rather splintered denominations compared to even now the mainline denomination. Now, last point on that. For a long time, a long time, the PCA and now the Evangelical Presbyterian Church insisted that their departure from the mainline church denomination had nothing to do with race. It was entirely a matter of things like, well, they are ordaining women, or they've moved away from the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's all about doctrine. It has nothing to do with race. Until now, when leadership of those, a new generation of leaders of those denominations say, yeah, it was a lot about race. And of course, when you look at their membership, until very recently, they have been almost totally, not quite totally, but almost totally lily white. They now are attracting some Black evangelicals, but for the longest time, especially in its origin, it was very much tied to this resistance to desegregation. Third, as a result of the departure of these folk, conservative theologically, but I would say even more conservative politically, as a result of these folks, it finally became possible in the early 1980s for the union, for the great split that had developed between North and South in the Presbyterian world to be overcome. 1983, the union of the Southern Church and the Northern Church to once again, finally, to create a new church. As I said last time, it took a long, long, long time for Presbyterians to heal that breach. And I think the main reason why it could happen is that by the 1980s, the people who were most resistant to it had left. They'd gone to the PCA. I think there's a direct connection between those two things. Two other points, and then I'll stop. As a result of the commitment of mainline Presbyterianism to the cause of desegregation, desegregated church and desegregated society, Blacks have assumed a much larger and more prominent role in the leadership of our church than ever before. Let me say that again. Blacks have achieved a much larger and more prominent place in the leadership of our church than ever before. Just think of, our stated clerk is an African American. The general presbyter of our presbytery, very able man, another African American. And you look throughout the denomination, increasingly, this is a church in which Black faces are very common in the top leadership positions. Having said that, let me add quickly, not so much in the senior pastorate of prominent individual congregations. Not so much that. But it is a striking thing. For the longest time, even though there were Black Presbyterians, they were not prominent in the leadership of the church. Now that's increasingly happening. Now, having said that, let me, if you will, go to the other side and say, it is striking that very few, that the percentage of non-whites in our denomination is small. The percentage of non-whites, people of color in our denomination is very small, and that in the typical congregation, it is a tiny fraction, tiny fraction. So even though you've got many more Black faces in positions of Black and other people of color in positions of leadership, in the typical congregation, it's overwhelmingly white. We are in the midst, however, of a period, and there was another fascinating article about this in the Post yesterday, in which there are now conscious efforts being made to create multiracial congregations. And it is beginning to happen in the Presbyterian world, beginning to happen. There are strategies that are being developed about this. And it'll be very interesting, I think, to see whether that really takes hold in the Presbyterian world, because overwhelmingly, and this is my last point, or no, second to last point, overwhelmingly, the Black population in the Presbyterian Church are in predominantly Black churches. The Black population are in predominantly Black churches, particularly in Washington, D.C., but not just Washington, D.C. Last point, very quickly, is this. In the last about 10 years, something very important has happened to the political identity of Presbyterians. I'm talking mainly about lay people. For the longest time, like most of our history, we've got data on this. One of the great things about Presbyterians is they accumulate data. We've got good data on this about the political, among other things, the political identification of Presbyterians. Until about 5 years ago, not the vast, but a majority of Presbyterians were Republicans. This was a Republican church for the longest time. Now it's evenly divided between between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They're all about equal, and that's a very important shift. And I think it reflects the story that I've been talking about here. As usual, I've gone longer than I should have, but I can bring it to a close now, at least in time for the announcements and maybe a question or two. I don't know.